There's long been a tendency in the study of history to focus on centralized unified states. When a state falls apart and gets divided into smaller localized powers, it's often seen as little more than a chaotic interlude until the next strong centralized power takes over. This was long the case for the Taifa period in Islamic Spain and Portugal. On top of the fact that Islamic history in the Iberian Peninsula generally gets less attention on the popular level, this period also falls between the Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba on one end and the Almoravids on the other, while also being a period where you see the shift from Muslim to Christian dominance in the peninsula. And because of this last point, it tends to be the expanding Christian kingdoms in the north, which people tend to focus on around this time. But in an overview of the world 1,000 years ago, the fall of Cordoba and the rise of the Taifa kingdoms of Al-Andalus is impossible to ignore, both because of the effects it would have on the rest of history, but also because it's plenty interesting in its own right. So today, join me as we see struggles for power in some parts, and very much business as usual in others. Let's take a look at Muslim Iberia 1,000 years ago. The Iberian Peninsula, what is today Spain and Portugal, was, at the start of the 8th century, under the rule of the Visigoths, a Germanic people who'd taken the land from the Roman Empire. In the years after 711, however, much of the peninsula was conquered by the expanding Islamic Empire, ruled by the Umayyad caliphs all the way in Syria, with the caliph being the successor to the Prophet Muhammad as the leader of the Muslim community. Now, the Umayyads were overthrown by the Abbasids in 750, but one of their princes managed to escape to Iberia in 756 and ultimately established himself as the leader of the province, which was known in Arabic as Al-Andalus. Despite their history with the Abbasids, however, the Umayyads, based in Cordoba, didn't contest the caliphal title, at least not right away. That would only happen in 929 when Abd al-Rahman III, after defeating several rebellions which threatened to tear his realm apart, declared himself caliph at a time when the Abbasids were little more than puppets of their own subjects all the way in Baghdad. But to understand the caliphate's ultimate collapse only a century later, we need to move on to the first caliph's grandson, Hisham II. Hisham's father died in 976 when he was only a boy, and so the realm was put under the care of several councillors, who all worked together selflessly for the well-being of the caliphate and the young caliph. Just kidding, there was a big old power vacuum, which ultimately led to the rise of one of the previous caliph's councillors, a man named Muhammad ibn Abdullah ibn Abi Amir, better known as al-Mansour. He was officially the Hajib, or chamberlain of the caliph, but from 976 until his death in 1002, al-Mansour was the de facto leader of Al-Andalus, with the caliph as a puppet, taking inspiration from the Buyids out east and their control of the Abbasid heartland, which I've already talked about in this series. And he used violent coercion and shrewd politics to make sure things stayed that way. At the same time, he was a very successful and effective leader, and this period is often known as the Caliphate's Golden Age. Beyond the usual promotion of art, poetry, and other forms of culture, he also regularly conducted successful raids on the Christian kingdoms to the north, extracting tribute, and mediated in their affairs, effectively establishing an Andalusian sphere of influence. In one of his most famous raids, he sacked Santiago de Compostela and had his prisoners carry the cathedral bells all the way back to Cordoba. In doing this, he presented himself as a champion of the faith, using jihad, or struggle, against the non-Muslims, as a way to legitimize his rule at home, something which hadn't been done to anywhere near the same degree by the Umayyads, since they didn't need to justify their position the way al-Mansour did. Now, the concept of jihad in Islam is very nuanced and complex, and it has evolved over time. At this time, it was used mainly for warfare against non-Muslims, though significantly, it wasn't necessarily expansion of the borders as it had been in the early years. It was more using warfare to secure the place of the Muslim community and strengthening its position. So, raids for plunder and tribute were considered valid forms of jihad. Another way al-Mansour held on to power was by maintaining a tight balance between the interests of various groups, especially when it came to the army. Now, at the time of the conquest back in the 8th century, the conquering forces included a number of Arabs, but the bulk of the forces were Berbers, traditionally nomadic North African peoples who were only fairly recently brought into the Muslim fold themselves. Many of these, Arabs and Berbers, were then settled across the newly conquered lands, with the expectation that they'd fight for the governor of Al-Andalus when needed. However, problems with local rebellions led the caliphs to switch to a non-settled standing army instead, made up of new non-settled Berbers brought into the peninsula, as well as Sakaliba, slaves taken as children from especially the Balkans and Eastern Europe, raised as Muslims, and put in military and bureaucratic positions, where it was hoped they would be loyal exclusively to the caliph since they had no external ties, a practice which had become common for the Abbasids. Al-Mansour continued this practice, bringing in larger numbers and paying them by essentially pushing the old landed class out of the army and having them pay additional taxes instead of military service. As a result, there was a clear line between the citizens of Al-Andalus and the army, who were also often seen as foreigners, even by the old established Berbers. Likewise, it was important for Al-Mansour to carefully balance the power of the Berbers and the Sakaliba, so that neither group could become so powerful as to try to overthrow the other, and him. But, of course, Al-Andalus wasn't just the army. The rest of the population were also a fairly diverse bunch. There were Arabs, both those descended from the first Arabs from the conquest, and later migrants into the peninsula, with most of the Caliphate's elites being Arabs. This situation was similar with the old Berbers, most of whom had come to settle into a sedentary lifestyle either in the countryside or the cities, with many becoming fairly Arabized. The majority of the population, though, were what were called Muwallads, that is, non-Arab or Berber native Iberians who converted to Islam after the conquest. In the early years, Muslims were in the minority, with most of the population being Christians. However, by the turn of the 11th century, Christians were now the minority, with most native Iberians having converted. Most were also speaking Arabic by this point, something which would lead to the distinction between Arab and Muwallad to disappear sometime around the 11th century, with many possibly not even seeing such a distinction anymore by the end of the 10th. Even amongst the minority Christian communities, Arabic seems to have dominated, with our only attested Christian writings from the 11th century being in that language. And this over a century after Christian leaders like Paul Albar decried the fascination of Christian youths with Arabic poetry. Though there is some evidence that a Latin-based romance was still being spoken amongst some communities of Muwallad Muslims, and possibly Christians as well. Finally, there were also Jews who became prominent in this time, especially in cities where they did trade. There are several letters in the Cairo Geniza collection, a collection of Jewish writings spanning centuries, which attest to extensive trade between Andalusian and Egyptian Jews at this time. So that was the state of things by the time of Al-Mansour's death in 1002. But despite everything he did for the Caliphate to flourish, the next decades would show just how much his rule, and especially the measures he took to keep himself in power, would make things a lot more difficult for everyone else to come after him. The position of Hajib was passed on to his son, Al-Muzaffar, establishing the Amirid dynasty. Al-Muzaffar would rule until his own death in 1008. He was a decent soldier, though not as good a ruler as his father. His popularity was iffy, and he wasn't as good at balancing the power between the Berbers and the Sakaliba in the army, which led to a couple of rebellions, but he managed to put those down. The same cannot be said about his brother and successor, however, Abd al-Rahman, nicknamed Sanchuelo due to how much he resembled his maternal grandfather, King Sancho II of Pamplona. Sanchuelo apparently didn't understand the nuances of his position and overstepped by making the Caliph, still Hisham II, declare him to be his successor, despite not being a member of the Quraysh tribe, the tribe of the Prophet Muhammad, which was seen as the main requirement for one to be Caliph. Apparently he thought that them both being related through their shared maternal Basque ancestry would be enough. It was not. Instead, it shattered any sense of legitimacy which Sanchuelo had, and pissed off pretty much everyone. In addition to this, he relied way too heavily on the Berbers in the army, which alienated other groups in government. Perhaps to make up for this, he left in the middle of winter on a raid into Christian lands, something everyone thought was a bad idea. But Sanchuelo either didn't care or was desperate for some legitimacy by following in his father's footsteps. But while he was away, a member of the Umayyad family, taking the name Al-Mahdi, overthrew the long powerless Hisham II and attempted an Umayyad restoration in Cordoba, with him as the new Caliph. When Sanchuelo heard of this, he turned around and came back to Cordoba, but his army slowly abandoned him on the road and he was found and executed before he could make it back. This begins a period known as the Fitna of Al-Andalus, with fitna meaning something like civil disorder, which would last until the final abolition of the Cordovan Caliphate in 1031. And since in most of my videos on the world 1,000 years ago, I've been focused on the decade of the 1020s or thereabouts, this will be the context for the rest of the video. This also means that, as I'm sure you can figure out by now, Al-Mahdi's rise didn't bring things back to normal. He only had a little bit of support, with only one Sakalibi general, Wadi, siding with him. The Berbers, who, as I mentioned, were given favor under Sanchuelo, turned to another Umayyad, Suleiman, who they wanted to install as their own puppet, and after making an alliance with the Christian king Sancho Garcia of Castile, they marched on Cordoba and ousted Al-Mahdi in 1009. Al-Mahdi then similarly got help from the Christian count of Barcelona, Raymond Borrell, and managed to take back Cordoba in 1010. But by now the people of Cordoba were sick of him, and he was arrested and executed, and Hisham II, the caliph he'd originally deposed, was restored. But the Berbers were still not happy, and they besieged Cordoba for the next 3 years until 1013, raiding the countryside and nearby towns unless they paid for safety. This would end with the sacking of Cordoba and the disappearance of Hisham II, who in all likelihood died. Now, I could keep going on until 1031, but suffice it to say that Cordoba went through many more caliphs, who I will list right here, none of whom lasted for very many years. Eventually, you even had the Hammadids, who were Berberized Arabs from the Quraysh tribe, who claimed that Hisham II had declared them as his heirs, and therefore they were the rightful caliphs. They would actually continue to claim the caliphal title until they lost the last of their territories in 1056. But for Cordoba, the city's leaders ultimately decided after the deposition of Hisham III in 1031 that it was much more trouble than it was worth, and that they wouldn't elevate any more caliphs to the throne. But by this time, the caliphate had already been so hollowed out that the so-called abolition hardly had much of an impact outside of Cordoba. By the time of the Berber sack of the city in 1013, there was no way any new caliph would be able to have anything resembling real imperium, real authority, over Al-Andalus beyond the capital. Hell, even Al-Mahdi didn't have anything like that. The only person who could at this point was the Hajib. Al-Mansour had already greatly diminished the caliph's authority in order to maintain his own. But with the fall of his son Sanchuelo, and especially after the devastation of Cordoba from 1010 to 1013, it became clear that central authority was falling apart, and Cordoba was certainly in no position to rebuild it. Instead, various local powers across Al-Andalus effectively began to rule as independent states, largely based in regional cities and towns. Some of their rulers had been governors put in place by the likes of al-Mansour, while others were local families who already had a great deal of power and took over as central authority collapsed. There often wasn't even any need for rebellion. They just kind of took charge and began to act autonomously. These new realms would be known as Taifas, from the Arabic muluk al-Tawaif, kings of factions, with Taifa being the singular of Tawaif. This was the term used to describe, amongst others, the successors of Alexander the Great after his empire collapsed. Taifas came in all shapes and sizes, from small city-states to large swaths of land on the frontier, to essentially isolated castles in the mountains. The historian Hugh Kennedy divides the new Taifa rulers into 4 categories based on their origin: Arab patricians, Old Berbers, New Berbers, and Sakaliba. When it comes to Arabs, most of them were already prominent families in cities or towns who took advantage of the political situation to establish themselves as autocratic rulers of the region. This was the case for the likes of Seville, Niebla, and Silves, to name just a few. In Seville, it was the Qadi, the chief judge, Muhammad ibn Ismail ibn Abad, who would establish himself and his successors as the Abadids. He was appointed Qadi by the Hamudid Caliph Al-Khazim in 1019, but made clear Seville's autonomy from Cordoba when Al-Khazim was ousted from the capital in 1023 and tried to flee to nearby Seville, but Ibn Abad refused to let him in. Zaragoza, all the way in the north, is a little bit different. Being on the frontier, it had long been quite autonomous from Cordoba, even before the 11th century, and was already being ruled by a local Arab dynasty, the Tujibids. They'd involved themselves in caliphal politics until 1018, after which they decided to instead focus on consolidating their power back home, likely realizing that they were gaining little by picking sides in the struggle for distant Cordoba. The Sakaliba, the slave soldiers and bureaucrats of the Caliphate, often came to power either as governors from the era of al-Mansour and his sons, who simply continued to hold on to power after the latter's fall, or they retreated to areas without powerful established local elites and took over there. Many of them established themselves especially in cities and towns on the Mediterranean coast, after abandoning Cordoba when al-Mahdi took over the Caliphate in 1009. Valencia, Murcia, Almeria, Denia, and Tortosa were all ruled by Sakaliba, though in 1021, al-Mansour's grandson, Abdelaziz, would take over Valencia in a coup installed with the help of Zaragoza. He was the only Amirid, descendant of al-Mansour, to successfully rule a Taifa. Although some of the Sakaliba would have some success, few of them managed to establish lasting dynasties. In part, this was because many of them were castrated when taken in, so couldn't have any children. And also, unlike other slave soldier kingdoms like the Mamluks in Egypt, Al-Andalus stopped importing new Sakaliba after the fall of the Amirids in 1009, so they couldn't replenish their numbers. This meant that these dynasties often either died out, or they were overthrown or conquered since they had only a small support base. The old Berbers, those who'd been established before the time of al-Mansour, often came to power by entrenching themselves in the areas where they had long been settled, especially when those areas were isolated like El Puente and Albarracin. Others came to power due to political dynamics. The Aftasids, long settled in southern Al-Andalus, served the leader of Badajoz, a Saklabi named Sabur, and took over after his death in 1022. In Toledo, factional conflicts between the governor and the Qadi led to one side inviting Ismail al-Zafir, a Berber whose family had been prominent in the region, to rule the city in around 1019. Ismail and his descendants would rule Toledo for 3 generations until 1085. Finally, there's the new Berbers, those who were part of the Caliphal army and who played an important role in the struggles over the Caliphate. By the time they got their candidate Suleiman into power in 1013, many of the Berbers had come to realize that the position of the Caliph was becoming too weak to rely on for their own prosperity. Instead, they began settling along the south of the peninsula, receiving grants of territory from their newly elevated puppet. There were a lot of these kinds of taifas, most of which were rather small, the most prominent of which was Granada. The Zirids, one of the most important clans amongst the new Berbers, were given nearby Elvira, but they then founded the new city of Granada, which would quickly grow to become a major center of power. Although these taifas were granted by the Caliph Suleiman, no one was under any illusion that the Caliph had real power over the Berbers. This was simply one way to legitimize both parties, the Berbers through caliphal assent to their rule, and the Caliph by assuring he had allies nearby, though in the end this didn't help him all that much. But legitimacy was important for Taifa rulers, since, in theory, they were still ruling their regions on behalf of the Caliph in Cordoba. They just stopped caring who that Caliph was, since there was no way he could actually do anything to interfere in their affairs. Many Taifa rulers presented themselves as Hajib, using the same title that al-Mansour had, just now regional rather than over the whole of Al-Andalus. After the end of the Caliphate in Cordoba, Seville even claimed that they'd found the lost Hisham II, the Caliph under al-Mansour who had disappeared in 1013, and many Taifa rulers accepted him as Caliph. But in 1060, when he would have been around 100 years old, the rulers of Seville revealed that he'd actually died back in 1044 and they just didn't bother to replace him. After that, many Taifas just declared their loyalty to an unspecified caliph on their coins and in their prayers, while Zaragoza kept Hisham II's name on their coins until at least 1083. Which I think goes to show just how much this had become a matter of legalizing constitutional tradition more than anything else. But there were also other ways to legitimize one's rule. The Hamudids, ruling in the south, simply claimed that they were the rightful caliphs, even when they weren't in power in Cordoba. On the other hand, the Sakaliba governor of Denia, Mujahid, elevated his own caliph in 1013, but was happy to just keep him in Denia as a puppet for his own legitimacy without trying to impose him on the whole of Al-Andalus. But Mujahid also had another more unique tactic. Unlike al-Mansour, none of the Taifa rulers really used jihad against the Christians as a political tactic. The rulers of Seville tried this, but their army was intercepted and attacked by the ruler of Badajoz. But despite land raids getting most of the attention, sea raids, piracy, were also considered a legitimate form of jihad, and Mujahid knew this well since he was put in charge of such raids on Christian coasts by al-Mansour. He continued this policy as an independent Taifa ruler, and both Arab and Latin sources note the increase in Islamic piracy in the Western Mediterranean around this time. Although his conquest of most of Sardinia would be repelled by a joint Pisan-Genoese coalition in 1016, he continued to raid the coasts from Barcelona to southern Italy until his death in 1044, extracting plunder, tribute, and legitimacy for his rule. But Denia was not only a base for raids, it was also an important trading center, and it was the combination of trade and plunder which made it wealthy. In fact, many of the coastal taifas were important centers of trade with the rest of the Mediterranean, exporting Andalusian products from the peninsula's interior and importing foreign goods. And this is something important to keep in mind. Although the political landscape of Al-Andalus was changing, the Taifas largely managed to thrive, some of them better off than when their wealth was being siphoned towards Cordoba. Cities like Zaragoza, Valencia, Seville, and Toledo were developing into centers of wealth and culture in their own right. Seville overshadowed Cordoba for the first time as the most important city in the Guadalquivir Valley, and Valencia, never all that important until now, continued on a path starting in the late 10th century to become one of the most significant Western Mediterranean ports. And for most people, outside of the region around Cordoba, life went on more or less unchanged, especially in the rural communities in larger taifas, which were often much more distant from city politics. The fact that the Taifa rulers managed to maintain a sense of legitimacy made it so that the transition from Caliphate to Taifas went largely unfelt in most places, again with some exceptions, namely Cordoba, and cities where there were larger power struggles, though these were rarely anywhere near as devastating. Conflict between the Taifas would mostly come about in the 1040s and later, especially as Seville and Granada started expanding to conquer their smaller neighbors. Christian rulers would also begin to intervene and establish themselves over Muslim rulers for the first time, as I mentioned at the beginning, extracting a form of tribute, which forced some Taifa rulers to increase taxes, which caused instability. The major turning point is often seen as the surrender of Toledo to Alfonso VI of Castile-Leon in 1085, which, in combination with struggles for dominance amongst Taifa rulers, led to the invitation of the Almoravids into the peninsula, who would end up conquering all remaining Taifas by the early 1100s. But in the 1020s, as the Taifas were becoming concrete political entities, no one could have really known that that was going to happen. It's easy to look back on it from the future, knowing what would ultimately occur, and see it as inevitable. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the state of affairs, although lamented at the time by some, especially pro-Umayyad and pro-Amirid figures, was simply seen as the new normal by others, and for many, continuity was stressed more than change, even as changes were taking place. So, far from just a chaotic mess between two periods of prominence, I hope this video has given you some appreciation for this interesting part of Spanish and Portuguese history. As always, there is way more than I could possibly fit into a single short overview like this. If you want to know more, I encourage you to check out the video's description, where I've listed most of my sources, as well as other recommended works on the topic as good places to start. As always, I thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.